Thank you, everybody, for being here. Welcome to the next 20 years in mobility. Before we get started, I just wanted to go through a few housekeeping items. My name is Tom Barbieri. I'm Dunsky's Director of Communications and Market Engagement. So just a few things. Due to the great turnout, we have disabled the chat, but we do invite everyone to submit their questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of their screen. And please, ask questions in English or French. And if anyone needs closed captioning, you can turn that on by clicking the Show Captions button at the bottom. So I'll quickly go through the agenda. So we'll start with some opening remarks from Philippe Dunsky, our president. Then we'll turn it over to our mobility practice co-leads, Jeff Turner and Lindsay Wigginton, who will talk about what we're seeing over the next 20 years of the mobility transition. Then we're really pleased to be having a discussion with three of our clients from BC Hydro, the City of Vancouver, and Metro Vancouver. And then we'll wrap it up with audience Q&A. And again, we invite you to submit your questions. So without further delay, I am happy to send it over to Philippe Dunsky to say a few words.
Great. Thanks so much, Tommy. You hear me well? All right, great. I certainly don't need to see my face, so if we can move on from that. Really, thanks so much for joining us for this webinar. I'm just going to say a couple of words about our firm and what we do, and also why we do it, and talk briefly about the challenges and opportunity of mobility before passing it on to our experts, Jeff and Lindsay. So for those of you who don't know us, we're a consulting firm, but we're a bit of a unique one in that we are entirely specialized in one thing and one thing only, and that is the energy transition. So energy transition is what we work on day in, day out, and have been doing so for 20 years now. Thus the 20th anniversary and the 20-year outlook. For those of you who know our firm or who know the people in our firm, you'll know that we've got a team of about 65 people. Roughly speaking, about half of our team are analysts, are number crunchers, or people who are looking at the numbers, doing the deep forecasting, figuring out what is happening, what is coming, what is possible, at what cost, at what benefit, what the business case looks like. They're crunching the numbers in a very deep and sophisticated way with some really strong models behind them. That's about half our team. The other half are fundamentally strategists. So they're figuring out, all right, if we want this to happen, how do we make it happen? All right. So what are the policies? What are the investments that we need to be making? What other market interventions need to happen? So we're about half analytics, half strategy, and entirely focused on the energy transition and on each of its major components, being on the demand side, buildings, transportation, and industry, and of course the energy systems themselves that need to feed and power it all. Like I said, we've been around 20 years, 60-odd people, and we have about just over 1,000 projects under our belt at this point that we've done for our clients across North America. And I should say that we're very much focused North America. If you skip to the next slide, but very briefly, our clients are fundamentally, you're looking at lots of governments, lots of utilities, and a growing number of large corporates who are really looking to either accelerate the energy transition or understand and navigate it. And again, across those four sectors and across both countries. Since we're here to talk about mobility, I'll just talk about the mobility side of it very specifically. In terms of mobility, our clients are going to be the same. Again, lots of governments, lots of utilities, and lots of corporates. If you skip to the next slide, by the way, or just click that button. And the work that we do in mobility, we've done somewhere north of 200 projects specifically on mobility, and most of that is around electrification of transportation. To be straight, that's where we see the vast majority of the transition happening. We've done those, across across Canada, from BC to Newfoundland, across the US, from California to Massachusetts, and everywhere in between. And fundamentally, what we're doing is, like I said before, crunching the numbers. So forecasting demand for vehicles, for charging infrastructure, for power, at a very granular level sometimes. Sometimes it's at a provincial or state level. Sometimes it's down to 5-digit zip code or three or four letter postal code. So we do those forecasts. We develop the strategies to make sure there's enough charging infrastructure in the ground to support this transition. We develop the policies, we develop market strategies, go-to-market strategies for our clients, look at the business cases, understand them, develop them, and then build the plans to harness those opportunities. We help some clients, in fact, a large number of clients, to transition their fleets, their vehicle fleets. And then we do a whole bunch of due diligence especially for investors who are looking to put their capital into this transition. A lot of other things, but these are kind of the top line items that we do in this space. But why, right? The why is simple and straightforward. This is, and I think everyone on this who's joining this webinar knows this pretty well. If you go to the next slide, by the way, this sector is about a quarter of the challenges that we have in front of us. It's about a quarter of energy use, be it in Canada or in the US. It's about a quarter of emissions in both countries. It varies a little bit. In Canada, it's about 22% of emissions. In the US, it's about 28%. But simplify it, we're talking about roughly a quarter of our energy and our emissions challenges. And so it's a really big chunk. We just can't afford to miss this one. And I would even say, if there's one sector for which the transition, nothing here is easy, but if there's one sector that is easier than the rest to make happen, it's transportation. So I'm very, very bullish. I have been from the beginning about the transition, especially toward electricity in transportation. We work on this issue. We all know there's a lot of headwinds these days, a lot of change afoot, especially politically. And nothing is ever going to be simple and straightforward. We know that. But our firm belief is that this transition is happening. And it's not a question of whether, it's a question of when, and most importantly, of how we do this in a way that fundamentally, in terms of transportation at least, really hits three top considerations. It needs to be reliable, it needs to be affordable, and it needs to be predictable. And we all understand implicitly why we're talking about reliability and affordability, otherwise this doesn't happen. But let me just talk really briefly about predictability, and then I'll pass it on. We need clear line of sight. We're not going to have certainty about exactly where we're going, but we need to have some clarity, the greatest degree of clarity possible, the clearest line of sight possible, to know where we're going in order to what? In order to attract the investment, to crowd in private investment, private capital, to build out the infrastructure that we need to make this happen. The infrastructure, be that public charging on the one hand, or on the other hand, electricity infrastructure, so the generation, the transmission, the distribution, to get that power to the charging infrastructure to actually be able to power this transition. So that's where reliability starts and ends, is on the infrastructure side, and predictability is what will drive that infrastructure into the ground and drive the capital toward it. So we talk a lot about predictability. Policies help with predictability, investments help with predictability, and that's just critical, both to ensuring that we have a reliable system and to ensuring that it's an affordable one as well. So those are my top three considerations, the things that keep me up at night or get me excited: reliability, affordability, and predictability when we're talking about the transition in transportation. And I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to pass it on to our leading experts on these issues who are going to talk to us about the how we make this happen in a smart way. Pass it on to Jeff and Lindsay. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Philippe. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. We're really excited about this discussion and in particular about the discussion we'll have with our guest speakers in the second half of the webinar. My name is Jeff Turner. I'm the Director of Clean Mobility, and Lindsay and I co-lead our Clean Mobility branch at Dunsky. So my own background, I've got an engineering background. I've been with the firm for 8 years now. And prior to that, I used to work for BC Hydro's PowerTech Labs. So from 2012 to 2016, I was involved in some of the first deployments of public charging infrastructure, which is a big piece of this puzzle, of course. And prior to that, I used to work for a few different electric and hybrid vehicle manufacturers. So really been in the EV space my whole career for over 15 years now. And yeah, looking forward to diving into a few topics, but maybe I'll just let my colleague Lindsay introduce herself as well.
Thanks, Jeff, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're dialing in from. So I'm Lindsay. I, as Jeff said, work really closely with him on the mobility team here at Dunsky. My focus is a lot on the work we do with municipalities. My background is as an urban planner, working in the municipal sector, as well as in the nonprofit sector around transportation electrification.
Awesome. Well, to kick things off, I'm going to start with a quick presentation here before passing the mic over to Lindsay. But the overall question here that we wanted to ask was, what will the next 20 years look like in the EV transition, and what should we be preparing for? And I thought it'd be helpful to start by looking back, maybe not 20 years, because 20 years ago there really wasn't much happening on the EV front. But it was just under 15 years ago that the first mass-produced EVs were starting to hit the market. So when I was at BC Hydro, we had a few Nissan Leafs. They're great little cars. But I think just putting those numbers up on the screen really helps recognize how far we've come. And so I think a lot of folks who are in the industry now might be familiar with the current crop of EVs and the capabilities. But I think it's helpful to take a step back and look at these numbers and see how much progress we've seen, both in terms of the range capabilities of these vehicles. And I think very complementary to that is also the incredible fast charging capabilities. I never would have thought these numbers were possible, but we are at a point now where I think most people can probably go on a long trip without seeing much of a compromise compared to a gas vehicle. And this is all in the context where costs are coming down as well. And so to me, it doesn't take that much imagination to extrapolate from here and think about what the market is going to look like 15, 20 years from now. And I think the trajectory is pretty obvious. Now, these are a few examples. There are obviously a ton of other models available on the market, dozens of light-duty vehicle models. But even in the medium and heavy-duty space as well, I think this is where, if I think 10 years ago, there were still a lot of folks saying that there were a lot of transportation segments that were just simply out of reach of electric vehicle technology. And since then, we've just watched those hard to electrify segments get fewer and farther between. And so we're now at a point where there's really healthy competition from all of the major truck manufacturers that are going after those large Class 8 trucks. And the capabilities of these vehicles is increasing over time. Starting obviously with some of the lower hanging fruit. But I think, again, if we look into the future, it's pretty clear to see that it's going to be hard to find any of these niches that are really out of reach of that electric vehicle technology. So these are just a few examples. I wanted to give a shout out to the folks at CalSTART and Clean Energy Canada that have put together some really valuable resources to help just document all those vehicle options and help the folks that are trying to make decisions understand what's available to them on the market. So really amazing progress on the industry side of things and the technology improvement, but this, of course, is not happening in a vacuum. And we've also seen a very supportive policy environment as well. So probably a great example is what we've seen on charging infrastructure. So when I joined Dunsky and I wrapped up a few years at BC Hydro, we had just gotten the first 30 fast chargers in the ground in BC. And then I proceeded to drive across the country in a U-Haul with my brother. And wow, I spent a good chunk of that drive thinking about how hard it was going to be to be able to cross this massive continent with reliable electric vehicle infrastructure. And here we are just 8 years later, and you can basically get anywhere you want in North America. There might be a few parts of the continent that are slightly out of reach. You might need to do a bit of planning if you're really doing a long distance trip. But a week ago, I went to the Montreal Auto Show with my son, and we got into the Chevy Equinox EV. We wanted to try out the navigation system with the new built-in charging planning system. And first thing that popped into my head, let's go to Whitehorse. And it plotted out that trip in a few seconds, 19 stops along the way. And I think it's just incredible that those kinds of trips are now possible. And that's thanks to a lot of support from the public sector, but increasingly more investment from private sector actors too. Also a lot of work on building codes to make sure that folks are able to charge their vehicles in multifamily buildings. And so a lot of pieces of the puzzle that I think we'll dive into a little bit more later in the discussion. Financial incentives are also a really important piece of the puzzle. And Philippe spoke to some of the volatility that we've been seeing the past few months. So really clear example of some of the uncertainty that we see in this space. So for financial incentives, I think we all recognize the important role that plays in making sure that this technology is more affordable. I think we've always known that that kind of support can't be around forever. So it's really just a question of how do we phase that support out gradually, hopefully in a way that isn't too disruptive for the industry and for consumers. And we started to see some really great examples of jurisdictions that are starting to target their limited budgets to make sure they're having as much of an impact as possible and helping folks that need those incentives the most. And finally, regulations. We've seen ZEV mandates and fuel economy regulations that have tried to hold the industry to certain targets, make sure that they're making that technology available, and that certainly really helped to kickstart the market. And I think importantly, that plays a really valuable role in terms of that predictability that Philippe was speaking about, and how valuable that is to folks considering different types of investment into this transition. So we look at a lot of these factors, and many times the folks that hire us, whether they're governments or utilities or other actors, they're asking us to interpret these various factors and help to get a sense of where the market is going. And so we're often developing forecasts of EV adoption over the coming years. And this is just an example from a recent forecasting project that we did in one jurisdiction. And I think you can see right off the bat, there clearly is a fair amount of uncertainty in the next few years. And so that's a challenge. We do our best to try to anticipate, to what degree do certain policies or interventions in the market have an impact on the market. But, back to the theme of this webinar, if we really look 20 years down the road, I think you can also see that it's pretty certain where things are headed. Despite this near-term volatility, I think the overall trend here is pretty obvious. And we can fairly confidently say that the vast majority, if not all new vehicle sales by the end of the 2040s are likely to be electric. And in fact, even in terms of the number of vehicles on the road, we can see that in our most conservative scenario here, we're still saying that the majority of vehicles in circulation are likely to be electric by 2045. So I think that's very encouraging. And I think that's really helpful guidance as far as all the folks that need to make decisions and make sure that they're ready for this transition. Now, I think one of the most common questions that we get when it comes to the EV transition is whether or not the grid is ready for all of this electrification. And this is a really important question. So we've worked with utilities in all over Canada and a bunch of leading states like California, Colorado, and Massachusetts, who are really trying to grapple with the idea of how to make sure that they're ready for this load growth. And I think there's no beating around the bush. I think pretty clearly the load growth from EVs is significant. There's no getting around that fact. Now, the scale of that impact really varies from one grid to the next, but we're talking on the order of a doubling of peak demand by 2045. Can be a bit more or less than that, depending on the jurisdiction, but that's the kind of scale that we're talking about. And this is pretty significant. Now, there are a few things working in the favor of utilities. And first of all is the fact that this is not going to happen overnight. So you saw on that previous slide how there's a big difference between percent of vehicle sales versus the percent of vehicles in circulation. And even if we were to adopt, say, 100% of new vehicle sales were electric today, it would still be a solid 15 years before the fleet would fully turn over. And that really gives some breathing room to utilities. That gives them a bit of space to make sure that they can anticipate this transformation and be ready for it. Equally important as that is the fact that EV charging loads are potentially very flexible. There's a lot of flexibility in terms of when that charging happens, and that gives a lot of opportunity for the utility to accommodate that load. And I'll talk a bit more about that in the coming slides. But it's also important to remember that we're seeing a lot of parallel efforts to reduce driving and encourage folks to take more efficient transportation modes. Really great examples of that in New York City over the past few weeks with the new congestion charge. And I think it's really valuable to make the link there and help recognize that besides the benefits in terms of local air quality and congestion, that really makes this challenge of accommodating EV load growth easier if folks are choosing more efficient transportation modes. and utilities stand to benefit from some of those efforts as well. All told, though, what we're hearing from utilities that we're working with across the continent is that there's work to do, but the grid is not about to blow up. They can definitely handle this. They've been working to anticipate load growth for 100 years and stay ahead of that demand. But there certainly is work to do for them. In the near term, a lot of that work is going to focus down at the local level in the distribution system. And so that's why, for a lot of our forecasting projects, we're developing geographically granular load forecasts. And so this can be really valuable in the near term for utilities to get a sense of where they're likely to see hotspots of EV adoption and where they might need to prioritize investments in their distribution system, whether that's individual substations or the feeders that those substations are supplying. But we overlay our forecast of EV adoption on top of existing grid capacity and help give those utilities a sense of where they need to prioritize those capacity increases. Now, that said, there's more to it than just a number of factors that need to be taken into account. First and foremost is climate. And so we've seen on the next slide that climate can have a significant impact on the load impacts from EVs. So most obviously, I think most people are familiar with the fact that EVs get less range in the winter. And conversely, that means that they consume more energy in those winter months and they're charging more frequently. So that can really exacerbate grid impacts from EVs in colder regions. At the same time, some utilities in cold regions already have a fairly robust grid because they've designed that grid to be able to handle electric heating loads. And so I'm speaking from Quebec right now, and Hydro-Quebec is really fortunate in that they've built out that grid to be very robust. And so the incremental load growth from EVs is not quite as significant for them as it might be for another utility. That said, I'd say for the majority of utilities across North America, that's not the case. And in fact, what we're seeing is a lot of those jurisdictions are also seeing parallel efforts to electrify building heating demands as well. So that's really an important point to remember here, is that we can't consider EV load growth in isolation. There are a number of other transformations that are happening on the grid between building electrification, solar and storage that are really changing those baseline load profiles. And that's why it's really important to think through to how EVs fit into that puzzle in the long term and how this is going to impact how utilities plan for those peak loads. So maybe just a shout out right now, we'll mention some of the upcoming webinars, but we'll have another session focused on the energy sector a little later on, and we can dive into a little bit more about some of those other transformations that are happening in parallel. Now, I mentioned, though, that EVs are fortunately a very flexible load. And so there's a lot of opportunity to shift when that charging happens. And on the next slide, I wanted to start with the key opportunity here, which is that EVs are fundamentally over-designed for their daily needs. Nobody's going to switch to an EV unless they know they can do their once or twice a year trip to visit a relative 500 kilometers away, all while on a daily basis, their commute might only be 50 kilometers. Combine that with the fact that most people plug their vehicle in for 12 hours overnight most of the time. And if they only need 1 or 2 hours to charge during that period, there's a lot of flexibility in terms of when that charging can happen. So that's an excellent opportunity for utilities to minimize and avoid charging during peak periods and potentially even synchronize EV charging loads with variable renewable generation. And so that's a pretty exciting opportunity. Now, I've been working on that type of approach since my days at BC Hydro, and it's really progressed from sort of a science project to now something that's really ready for scaling. There are a number of technology options for managed charging, whether that's direct communications with the connectivity in the vehicle or with network connected charge stations in the home. But we're really already starting to see a number of utilities offering programs and providing incentives to encourage customers in their territory to sign up to these programs and make sure their EVs are charging at a good time for the grid. There's a lot of excitement, of course, for that next step, which would be, taking advantage, using that energy stored in the vehicle to provide power back to the grid through bidirectional charging or vehicle to grid. And this is a really promising opportunity. It's still taking advantage of the same fundamental over-design of these vehicles with large batteries that are largely sitting in the driveway unused most of the day. So there's a really big opportunity to take advantage of those assets There's a lot of potential benefits to the grid, and it's just really a question of whether we can find alignment between the value of those benefits from the grid and values to the end consumers. But I think one thing that we've seen over the past few years, a really good example from Ford here, advertising their website, that not only can you provide benefits to the grid, but this kind of capability is also really valuable from a resiliency perspective in terms of being able to power your home with your vehicle. And I think that's going to play a really important role in terms of driving those capabilities to market and potentially opening the door there for that grid interactive capability. The last note I'll say on grid readiness is just on the topic of fleet electrification. So as Philippe mentioned, we do a lot of work with fleets across North America in terms of developing roadmaps for decarbonizing their fleet and taking advantage of all this promising new technology. And we're seeing a lot of fleets that have recognized there's a great opportunity in terms of operational savings and justifying a significant transition of their fleet to electric vehicles. That said, we are seeing some challenges in cases where, we're talking about large vehicles in large numbers that are all charging in a single facility sometimes. And that can create single point loads on the grid that can be a challenge for utilities. And so we are getting to the point where we're starting to see some utilities becoming a bit of a bottleneck for some fleets that are eager to electrify, but who are being told it's going to take 18 months or 2 years for them to get a connection to the grid to be able to accommodate their charging needs. So there's a real challenge there in terms of utilities staying ahead of those requests, streamlining processes, and making sure that as we're starting to electrify these larger vehicles, we're not causing delays by and making sure that we're accelerating those deployments of the necessary supporting electrical infrastructure. And just one final note, I emphasize that EV charging loads are potentially very flexible. I would say this is somewhat less the case with fleets, and that's because fleets are much more likely to right-size their vehicles and charging infrastructure for their needs. They don't need to go on that once-in-a-while trip to visit a relative. They're really buying vehicles that do regular routes for the most part. And this means that there's less of an over-design in terms of electrical capabilities, and that therefore less inherent flexibility in terms of when that charging can happen. So that may be an additional challenge for some fleet types where utilities may have to get used to a bit of a conflict there in terms of fleets that need to charge their vehicles during a given window, and trying to see how much they can shift that window in a way that benefits the grid as well. So a lot of really exciting topics on the grid side, but I wanted to pass the mic over to my colleague Lindsay to talk about a few other challenges that we'll be grappling with out into the 2040s.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. And I'm going to bring it home with a few more thoughts around challenges specific to charging deployment. And then we're going to bring on our panelists who are also going to help us dig into that topic. So as Jeff mentioned, there's been major work done over the last several years to build out sort of the North American charging corridor and make sure we're filling in gaps, and we're getting pretty close. And what we're seeing is that, our challenges in the next 15 to 20 years will increasingly be concentrated in getting enough public charging supply into densifying urban areas. And so right now, a lot of what's driving the need for coverage is sort of sending that signal to prospective EV adopters that you're going to be okay. If you get an EV, that long distance charging will be there for you when you need it. But unlike early adopters, sort of mid and late stage adopters are more likely to be folks who don't have access to charging or maybe even parking at home. And so they're going to be relying full time on public charging. Getting that supply in place soon is really important. Over the last few years on our end, we've seen a lot of governments, take the important step of setting really clear infrastructure targets and strategies to achieve them. In the US, of course, a lot of that has been driven by the requirements under the NEVI funding. Here in Canada, some strategies we've been really glad to be a part of include Quebec's charging strategy, released a couple of years ago, committing to invest $500 million in public charging ports, as well as retrofitting multifamily buildings to be EV ready. Also, municipally, the Toronto Parking Authority has installed about 500 ports so far and is committed to building out a lot more. And so there's been a lot of movement on the public side, and also, especially in the last couple of years, toward looking at how to accelerate private sector contributions, either through offering de-risked loans, and I'm thinking about the Canada Infrastructure Bank, the Loan Programs Office in the US, and also creative ways that cities are looking to, either through regulation or incentives, sort of compel more contributions from the private sector. And we'll dive into that with some of our panelists in a moment. This graph here just shows some of the forecasting work we've done with the Canadian government, looking at sort of as that blue dotted line of EV adoption grows, how do we need to meet that demand in terms of different types of public charging. Some of the other questions, we've asked ourselves and we get asked is, okay, that's a lot of ports. Like, is there really enough space for this in our cities? And the work we've been able to do with many of our clients looking at sort of spatial distribution and neighborhood level targets really affirms that, yes, actually, there's enough space. For better or worse, there's a lot of parking in our cities. And even as we look to shift some of that into higher and better use and redevelopment, there is enough space for charging. It's really a challenge around getting that investment in place. And just before I wrap up, I want to touch briefly on some of the sort of further into the future looking work that we're following as well. These points are drawn from a really important paper by Emily Grubert and Sarah Hastings-Simon, talking about this concept of the mid-transition. So, as Jeff highlighted in some of those graphs, we know we're going to get to 100% sales, sometime in the 2030s, but the time it takes to actually turn over the whole fleet will be another, 15 to 20 years maybe for those last stragglers. And the bottom line here is we need to be making sure that we're bringing all groups along in this transition in order to sort of bolster all the work that we're doing today and to sort of address some of the more identity disruptions and distress that we're seeing and that's contributing to some of those headwinds right now. And so in the 2040s, we'll be existing in a world where there's both conventional fueling infrastructure and EV charging infrastructure. And we think that decision makers will start asking questions around what are the scrappage programs or other things we can use to help sort of final folks move to electric vehicles? What are ways we sort of guarantee access to this kind of infrastructure? And so as a segue, I'd love to bring on our three panelists now. We're going to hear from some pretty impactful folks who are setting strategy and deploying charging infrastructure in one of Canada's leading electric vehicle regions. So for those of you who might be less familiar with what's going on in British Columbia, in the third quarter of last year, BC hit a 25% sales rate of electric vehicles, which puts it on par with the pace of change in California and a little bit behind Quebec, which was at 35% in that same quarter. And the success in BC, has been the result of leadership at all levels. The government of British Columbia, for example, has been proactive from an early stage. They assigned a really clear mandate to BC Hydro to invest in charging. They offered early and consistent financial rebates and ambitious ZEV mandate targets, among many other things. And we're going to hear today from three folks working at different orders of government or utilities and sort of what's happening on the ground. So I'm pleased to introduce Leslie Ng. She's the Senior Sustainability Specialist at the City of Vancouver. She is sort of the hub of Vancouver's EV charging ecosystem, and her role is to develop the strategy, policies, and programs for the City of Vancouver. Also welcome Molly Brewis. She's the team lead for public infrastructure planning at BC Hydro, and she's going to say a little bit more about sort of what BC Hydro is and what their network is looking like today. And then finally, Morgan Braglovich. She's an air quality planner at Metro Vancouver. And among her many hats, Morgan co-chairs the Electric Mobility Peer Network, which brings together municipalities and First Nations from across BC to accelerate the electric mobility transition. I just want to add before we get into the questions, this is a North American focused webinar. We do work across North America. So why are all our guest speakers focused in BC? And this was an intentional decision on our part, given that we're thinking about what things might look like in the 2040s. We really wanted to highlight sort of how different organizations are working together in sort of one specific jurisdiction as a way of sort of zooming back out to the bigger picture. And we also thought that highlighting some of the specific collaborations and policies would be really insightful. And just a reminder, you'll have an opportunity to put questions to the whole panel at the end of this webinar. So please do submit your questions in the Q&A function, and you can do that either in English or in French. So to start things off, I'd love to turn it over to you, Molly, to tell us a little bit about the work you've been doing to complete BC's regional network of charging stations, a little bit about how your work is shifting in urban areas, and maybe you could talk too about some of the collaborations that you lead with cities and First Nations to make it happen.
Great, thanks very much. Good morning. I'm grateful to be calling in today from my office and not a parking lot in Vancouver, BC, on the traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. For a bit of context, BC Hydro is a vertically integrated public electric utility. That means we do it all, from generation to transmission to distribution. And now, importantly, for the context of this discussion today, public EV charging. We serve 95% of our province, or approximately 5 million customers, and 98% of our energy comes from clean or renewable sources, primarily hydropower, as our name suggests. My team in EV service delivery is actively contributing to the province's goal of having 10,000 public EV charging ports in service by 2030 to support that 100% ZEV sales mandate by 2035. In terms of BC Hydro's contribution to this, our public charging network today has the largest geographical scope of any provider in BC. And I checked our dashboard this morning. We're currently operating at 134 locations with 434 ports in service. So we have very aggressive plans to expand that to as much as 3,000 ports by 2030. Something that I wanted to highlight today that we're really proud of is that at the end of last summer, we completed our electric highway. With that, we have one DC fast charger minimum every 150 kilometers, or that's one every 93 miles along all key travel corridors and highways. Our province is vast, so to put this into perspective, as you see on the screen there, our province of BC is twice the area in size as the state of California, with really diverse terrain and, of course, quite harsh winter conditions, particularly in the north. The electric highway constitutes 155 EV charging sites. They weren't all delivered by BC Hydro, so we constructed about 70% of those, but the Ministry of Transportation and Transit, FortisBC, local governments, Indigenous communities, and partnerships with the private sector made that all happen. And again, just to put this into perspective, which I think is quite a fascinating stat, if you drive from where I am here in Vancouver all the way to our most northern station at Lower Post, which is right at the Yukon border, that's 2,000 kilometers, and that's the equivalent distance as driving from here to Los Angeles. So quite a tremendous feat. We're really proud of having filled in the charging there. I think another key piece of this was working together with private landowners, Indigenous communities, and again, municipalities who own all of this land. We don't, so we need to partner with them to make this happen. And also want to acknowledge the support of both the provincial and federal governments for providing funding through their grant programs for that. I think this sends a strong signal and gives people the confidence that their next vehicle can be an EV, as they can confidently road trip anywhere in the province and know that they can have an EV station that they can depend on to charge at. In terms of our partnerships with municipalities, so yeah, post-electric highway, because we built out so many stations in rural and remote areas, our focus is shifting this year back to urban areas with high population density, where the majority of the EV stock is located. And we have really strong collaboration with municipalities in particular in Metro Vancouver and in fact across the province. This is for a few reasons. First of all, they have land and they have facilities that are public gathering points. So arenas, community centers, performing arts facilities with large surface parking lots. And they all have their own climate goals that they're trying to achieve. And so partnering with us is really a win-win solution. They're also really aligned with the premise of our program, which is around affordability. And we operate on a cost recovery basis to keep our rates affordable rather than a profit-driven basis. So a few partnerships that I want to highlight is first with the city of Delta, south of us near the US border. It's actually the photo shown behind me here. We've got 2 large charge hubs that we've built out in recent months with 8 to 10 ports each. This one here is a sports development complex, and we're seeing very steady increase in utilization of those sites, up to 20-25% plus just in a few months having been opened. City of Surrey is also a very strong partner. That's just east of us here in Vancouver. They have a very high EV adoption rate, and we built 4 big charge hubs there last summer. Again, very steady increase in utilization. And then, of course, I have to mention our partnership with the City of Vancouver and Leslie's team. We're working to expand some of our existing sites there where we see extraordinarily high usage, 50% plus. Some of these are a bit more challenging because they're curbside installations, back sort of in the infancy of our program when we were doing smaller installations. And then we're also looking at new sites that will be captured by their upcoming business licensing changes for commercial parking lots, which I think Leslie might touch on a little bit later. And then finally, we do have some strong partnerships with First Nations, which is a real focus of our program as well. As examples of this, Seaward Island First Nation and the Chehalis Band have gas stations in the Lower Mainland, and so we found good partnerships there. One of those is already constructed, and one is in our queue to be constructed in the next coming few months. And so we're able to provide that service in collaboration with those First Nation partners.
Thanks, Molly, and congrats for all the work that's been done so far. We're going to zoom in from sort of province-wide to regional level. And so, Morgan, I'd love to pull you into the discussion. You know, we've had the pleasure of working with you to produce resources that you're using to coordinate with municipalities across the region. Maybe you could say a little bit more about sort of what your work has looked like to date and what's top of mind for the region as you think about charging build out.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay, and hi, everybody. So to kick things off, maybe I'll just provide a little more of an intro to Metro Vancouver Regional District, as I know we have like a good variety and diversity of folks on the call calling in from all over the place. So I'm sure many are not familiar with the region. So Metro Vancouver Regional District is a federation of 23 members, which are shown here on the map, located on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. So our members consist of 21 municipalities, one electoral area, which is over there in the left, which is where the University of British Columbia is located, and one Treaty First Nation, Tsawwassen, which is located in the southwest portion of our region. And as you can see there, we have 2.8 million residents in the region, which is over half of the BC population, to give you a sense of how many different residents we're serving. So Metro Vancouver is a regional government rather than a municipality. While still a local government, the services we provide are slightly different. So Metro Vancouver provides utilities across the region, including water, sewage, and waste management. And one of those services is air quality management. So Metro Vancouver monitors and manages air quality in the region and the surrounding airshed, and that's the team that I work within. So one of the core functions in our team and across Metro Vancouver as a whole is to support coordination and collaboration for our members. So as Jeff, Lindsay, and Molly have said, we're seeing a really high uptake of EVs in our province and in our region. And a couple municipalities in our region have actually seen EV sales hit as high as 40% in some quarters, which is awesome to see. So as we see that rapid uptake of EVs, there's been a push of interest for us to convene folks who are working in this area. And something I often say is that even as someone who works in this space every day, I find it's challenging to keep on top of all the developments and changes going on because it is so fast moving, so fast paced. So it really helps to have these opportunities to work together with peers. One thing I'll highlight is something that Lindsay briefly mentioned. A key forum for us has been the BC e-mobility peer network. So that's supported by BC Hydro, as well as the Community Energy Association, and it's an awesome peer-to-peer network for local government staff. It's BC-wide, and I am one of the network co-chairs, and that's been an amazing space for people to share their successes and challenges and work through questions together. So in terms of kind of what we're seeing and working on here in the region, as the provincial policy here in BC combined with the market doing its thing have been successful in increasing EV uptake, we've heard a need to consider EV charging at the regional level in the same way that we think about other transportation systems like transit and roads at a regional level. So as a first step to start thinking about this in a more structured way, we recently completed guidance for the collaborative deployment of EV charging. So that's that project that Lindsay mentioned. And BC Hydro was one of our partners for that. And we got a lot of really valuable input from our municipalities in the region as well. So this project is responding to that interest from our members, from people across the region, and understanding what EV uptake and EV charging deployment is going to look like. By looking at expected EV uptake across the region, forecasting the associated demand for EV charging, and recommending some actions that key players in the region can take to ensure that EV charging deployment is keeping pace with supply. And of course, like one of the challenges and opportunities that people will be familiar with is that sometimes it's unclear what those roles are, what the opportunities are, kind of who's doing what. So we really saw this as an opportunity to kind of be the first step in that conversation to bring people together so that we can be working on this one together. And I guess as a spoiler, we expect that almost all vehicles on the road in our region will be EVs by 2050, if not sooner, which is a pretty short window to make that transformative change needed to support this huge shift. So that work gave us a great jumping off point for actions for EV charging deployment that can move us forward together and help with that collaboration and coordination effort. Tons coming out of that, but if I was going to highlight one thing that is kind of top priority, will be to support the retrofit of existing multifamily buildings in the region. So there are a lot of multifamily buildings in Metro Vancouver. A lot of residents live in these buildings, and we know that accessing home charging will be the top choice for most, if not all people, and that accessing home charging will be more challenging in those buildings. So we're cognizant that this is an area that is going to require a lot of support.
Awesome. Thanks, Morgan. And I'm going to just close out the slides here so we can all kind of see each other better. Maybe just while you have the floor, you mentioned retrofitting existing multifamily buildings. Could you say a little bit about what the new construction regulation looks like across the region as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So our region has seen a lot of uptake of EV-ready bylaws, residential new construction, meaning that parking stalls that are under these bylaws have to have either an outlet or a junction box that's capable of supporting at least level 2 charging in parking stalls. So over half of the municipalities in our region have these requirements in place, including most of the larger municipalities. And for the most part, these require that all 100% of new parking stalls in residential development are EV ready. So that effectively covers the majority of new residential development in the region. So today, most parking stalls that are being built in new residential developments will be built to be EV ready. And on top of that, there's a growing list of municipalities in the region that are adopting EV-ready requirements for new commercial development. So these generally range from 20% to 45% of commercial parking stalls in new construction. And kind of a new one for me, I received an email recently from a municipal colleague that was asking about e-bike charging requirements. So that's not as common. That's something I've been paying as much attention to. But through that conversation, we learned there's at least one municipality in the region that has explicitly integrated requirements for e-bike charging into their requirements as well. So hats off to the municipalities in the region who've really been on the leading edge with this one. And it's been really cool to see everybody inspire and learn from each other.
Yeah, thanks for highlighting that. And I think I can't really emphasize enough how transformative those rules have been. Some municipalities have had them in place for up to 7 years now, and it gets us a lot of the way to meeting some of that future charging demand. So before we open it up for the Q&A, I'd love to hear from you, Leslie. Vancouver has done a lot of innovative stuff to sort of harness investment from the private sector in charging as well. Would love to hear about your approach in general and any specific programs or policies you'd like to highlight.
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Yeah, I just wanted to say, building on Morgan's comments on the EV ready policies, they've been so key in ensuring that we have future, we will have future supply. We built on the study that Morgan had mentioned that Dunsky you guys have done to model that demand for infrastructure. And we built on that and had Dunsky follow up with a bit of a gap analysis on what our current policies and programs would get us to. And it really helped in highlighting sort of what additional maybe areas that we need to look into in terms of encouraging more investment in infrastructure. And of course, having private sector investment in infrastructure is a really key tool. The city can't afford to do it all ourselves. We do own and operate a number of our own chargers, and we have almost reached our goal of having a DCFC within a 10-minute drive of anywhere in the city. But we do know with that curve in EV adoption, we need so much more, so many more ports, and so encouraging third-party investment is key. And one of the programs that we have right now is we have recent changes to our business license requirements, or business license fees. So if you were to install for gas stations and parking lots, so if you were to install a certain amount of EV charging for gas stations, that's 50 kilowatts, and for parking lots, that is 26.6 kilowatts, or about 4 level 2 chargers. So those business license changes will come into effect in January 2026. And if you install a certain amount of charging, your fee will stay relatively the same. And for parking lots, sorry, I should say it's also for parking lots that are 60 stalls and over that would need to install 26.6 kilowatts of charging. And if you don't install that certain amount of charging, your business license fees could go up to $10,000. So it is a significant amount, and it's a useful tool, I think, in incentivizing or encouraging that private sector investment. And in some of that modeling that we did with the gap analysis, that policy really helps to get us up to, I think it was almost close to 50% of the level 2s that we would be expecting in the city based on our current policies and programs. So it does represent a significant tool in helping to encourage that private sector investment. Of course, that's not enough. We're looking at other sort of options as well to encourage third-party investment, but that's been one of the useful tools, I think, that we've had.
Thanks for that overview. And there's like several other programs you've got going on that I'd love to ask you about as well. But in the last 10 minutes, I'm going to bring Jeff back on because I know, Jeff, you've been monitoring the Q&A. Are there a few questions that you want to put to the panel?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of great questions. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll be able to get to everything here, but Josh Reimer asked a great question about e-bikes. And I think putting in on our points about encouraging alternatives to vehicles. And I think, Vancouver as a whole in the region is a really great jurisdiction for that. And I guess he wants to know to what extent any of you have looked at the way incentives for e-bikes or other mobility options can help reduce congestion in urban areas. So maybe any of you want to speak to some of the other efforts beyond electrifying the four-wheeled vehicles that we have?
Yeah, a really cool example comes to mind, which is actually outside of the Metro Vancouver region, but is the best example that I've heard of so far, which is the Capital Regional District, which is our neighboring regional district on Vancouver Island, in partnership with the local university there and District of Saanich. Did a really cool program trying to do some research on this. So Saanich has a top-up incentive program for e-bikes, and they did some specific monitoring with researchers, I believe from UBC or the University of Victoria, that tried to put some numbers to this, because I agree it's been like kind of anecdotal on all sides with some great examples, but also kind of hard to sort of put your thumb on exactly what the impact would be. So I would say that's the best example I've seen of someone trying to do some studies on this and attach some numbers to it. And it was really positive results. I remember we heard about this at the e-mobility peer network, and the outcomes were really encouraging. And I, was pleasantly surprised at the positive impact that it was having in the region over there. So see if I can find a link maybe to share, but I would encourage everyone to look to that as a great example.
That's great. Thanks, Morgan. There was another good question that was asked actually in French by Christian, really sort of asking about, just long-term plannings, and curious if Vancouver and or Metro Vancouver have set long-term targets in terms of how much charging infrastructure is needed, how close that should be, what kind of spacing you're looking for. So I don't know if Leslie or Morgan, if either of you want to speak to any kind of targets that you have as guidance for how much infrastructure you want to be deploying.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the guidance that we've received is sort of the modeling work from the study that I mentioned, that was our sort of demand and gap analysis forecast. So, it projected quite a significant number of ports required by 2030, which, based on current policies and programs, where the gap wasn't, or that number isn't as scary as it initially is when we didn't do the gap analysis, but like beyond that, it really sort of escalates. So I'd say that that's sort of more where the targets, I guess, that are guiding us. And beyond that, we've kind of looked at what some additional policies and programs might look like. Yeah, but it's hard to forecast.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And Morgan, anything to add? I know you've also we've worked with you on some of those long-term plans, but I think some of the numbers can look pretty big, but how do you think that sort of contributes to the overall discussion of guiding what kind of investment is needed and what kind of policies need to be put in place?
Yeah, well, I would say based on the reaction we've had to kind of our projections for EV charging demand, one of the first things that does is kind of get people's attention. When we released that work, it kind of made, as Leslie said, a few people go, "Ooh, that seems a bit scary and expensive." So in that way, it's great to get the conversation started. And I think, as Leslie said, once you dive into it, especially if you break it down into like a sub-regional level, it starts to feel a bit more manageable. I think one of the big challenges with getting more specific is that there is a lot of uncertainty in what the balance is going to be between home and public charging, between fast charging and level 2. So I think we've identified those as areas that kind of need ongoing and continued conversation from everybody involved to make sure we're meeting the needs in one way or another. But I don't know if we're quite at the place where we're seeing a lot of strategies emerge at that level of detail. I think for sure we're seeing people work towards wanting to meet the expected demand, which is a great starting point. But yeah, it's so many unknowns and uncertainties of how things are going to shake out that makes it hard to get to that level of specificity, but hopefully we're going to get there.
Great. I think we have time for maybe one last question, and apologies to everyone who also submitted questions that we won't be able to get to. By all means, feel free to reach out to any of us. We'll put our contact information up on the screen and happy to continue the discussion offline. But I see a question from JM Toriel in BC, and he mentioned that he's an advisor with the EV charger rebate program that BC Hydro administers. And I think we spoke a bit about the amazing progress in BC, ensuring new buildings are being built with EVs in mind. And I just love how BC has now been able to shift the focus to tackling the existing building stock. And Molly, I was wondering if you could speak a bit to that program, specifically the retrofit program for multi-unit buildings. And I don't know, any thoughts you might have on, like, I think part of our goal with this webinar was to help the rest of North America build on that example and really sort of expand and scale up efforts to retrofit existing buildings, which is a big part of the challenge.
Yeah, thanks for that. So there is another team at Hydro focused specifically on rebate programs around home and workplace charging, some of which are funded by the provincial government through their Clean BC program. And so some of these numbers I'll cite are just as a reminder, specific to our service territory only, BC Hydro service territory, so for 95% of the province. So we know that in our service territory, there's about 15,000 MURBs, the vast majority of which were constructed prior to EV-ready building bylaws coming into effect in more recent years. And the number of parking stalls this represents is really tough to quantify because it could vary from 10 to 500 plus, but we estimate there are at least 500,000 stalls. Probably more than that. To date, of those, 189 MURBs, which represents 14,000 parking stalls, have received an EV-ready retrofit incentive through our programs. And there was a huge uptick in 2024. So about 7,700, or more than half of those parking stalls received that rebate. So there's been incredible, I guess, momentum built over the past year. And there was also about 2,100 actual chargers installed in MURBs and workplaces through this incentive program last year. So percentage-wise, it's still small, but there's progress being made. Our program in particular on the public charging side is really focused on bridging this gap in the interim while we know that there is a lack of charging infrastructure at home in those multi-unit residential buildings. So we are really focused on building larger charging hubs so that those folks have access 24/7 to public charging in the interim.
That's great. Well, thanks for shedding some light on that, Molly. I think that program is really inspiring. I think the key element there is that, I mean, the challenge is big, and you're working on scaling up the efforts to really make sure that they're appropriate for the scale of the challenge. So really appreciate that. Yeah, thanks to all of you. I think and to everyone for submitting great questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. Obviously a lot to talk about here, but I think we'll leave it at that for the questions. As I said, happy to follow up with anybody offline, and maybe I'll pass it over to Tommy to wrap things up.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff, and thanks to our speakers. Thanks to Jeff and Lindsay, to Morgan, Molly, and Leslie. Thanks everybody for joining us. We really appreciate your time and hope you found it insightful. And as you can see on the screen, we have 3 webinars that are upcoming. So we really hope that you'll join us for that. I think my colleague should be sending a link in the chat where you could learn more about each and register. So yeah, hopefully we'll see you soon. Thanks again for joining. Have a great day. Bye-bye.